They say a wedding is supposed to be the happiest day of your life. Mine began with 5 missed calls from my mother. None of them said congratulations. By the time I walked into the ballroom, every light shimmered like a promise someone else had already broken. 120 guests, a $50,000 ceremony, a lake view straight out of a magazine. And yet the 4 front rows marked family were empty. My mother had chosen my sister's engagement party instead. People whispered as I passed. Some pitied me, some pretended not to notice. I'd spent my whole life cleaning up my family's messes, keeping quiet, keeping polite. But tonight, I was the one they left behind. Lucas smiled from the altar, trying to steady me with his eyes. I smiled back, but every step felt like walking through glass. When the music swelled and the guests stood, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall, a bride who had everything but the one thing that mattered. They didn't just skip my wedding, they erased me. And by the end of that night, I decided I'd make them remember who I was no matter what it cost. The string quartet began to play just as the Vermont sun slipped behind the hills, turning the lake outside the windows into a sheet of gold. I stood at the end of the aisle bouquet, trembling slightly in my hands, trying to remember how to breathe. Everything looked perfect. The white roses, the candles flickering against glass, the smell of pine and wine. It should have been the happiest day of my life. But when I looked toward the front rows marked family, every seat was empty. 120 guests filled the room, dressed in pastel and champagne silk, whispering about how lovely it all was. Lucas was smiling near the altar, his tie slightly crooked, the same way it always was when he was nervous. He caught my eye and mouthed, "You're beautiful." I smiled back, but something inside me tightened. I kept waiting for a familiar face to appear at the doorway for a last-minute rush, a hand wave, anything. Nothing came. When the music swelled, I walked forward on cue, each step echoing louder than it should have. The photographer's flash caught tears on someone's cheek, but they weren't mine. Lucas took my hand. The ceremony was short, elegant, almost dreamlike. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, the room stayed quiet. That silence felt heavier than applause. After the kiss and cheers, we walked out under a cloud of rose petals. The guests clapped, laughed, raised glasses. I nodded, thanked them, posed for photos. People told me how lucky I was, how beautiful everything looked, how proud my parents must be. I said thank you, pretending not to notice the pity behind their smiles. Dinner was served in a ballroom with tall windows and crystal chandeliers. The sound of forks and glasses blurred together. Lucas squeezed my hand under the table, his smile soft. He whispered, "We did it, baby. You okay?" I nodded, focusing on the laughter of our friends, the rhythm of the jazz band, the scent of roasted lamb. Anything but the rows of empty chairs behind us. My phone buzzed near the edge of my plate. 5 missed calls. Mom. The name glowed like an old wound. For a moment I thought maybe she had changed her mind. Maybe she was outside the venue waiting to surprise me. I slipped away to the hallway heels, clicking against marble, and pressed play on her voicemail. Her voice came through sharp and breathless. "Call me back right now. Emily is falling apart. The engagement party is a mess. I need you to fix it." I stood there frozen. The background noise was laughter music, glasses clinking. I imagined her surrounded by people too busy saving my sister's big night to realize she'd skipped mine. When Lucas found me, I was still holding the phone. He asked, "Everything okay?" I slipped it into my clutch and forced a smile. "Just my mom. She'll call again." We returned to the dance floor, moving slowly under warm lights. Friends cheered when Lucas spun me, and for a few minutes I let myself forget. He whispered that I looked like something out of a movie. I wanted to believe it to be the carefree bride they all saw, but my mind replayed my mother's voice again and again. The rest of the evening moved in snapshots. The cake cutting, the toasts, my best friend's speech about how I always take care of everyone else before myself. The irony stung more than the champagne. Lucas's parents hugged me like their own daughter. His mom whispered that family wasn't always the one we were born into. By the time the last guests left, the candles had melted halfway down. The staff was clearing tables and the band packed their instruments. I sat alone at the head table, running my fingers along the rim of my glass. The lights dimmed until the reflections on the windows looked like ghosts. Outside, snow had begun to fall, light and slow, the kind that makes the air smell clean. Lucas came back in with his jacket draped over one shoulder. He kissed my forehead, told me the car was waiting. I leaned against him, exhausted. In the car, my phone buzzed again. I didn't look at it. Instead, I watched the lights of the lodge fade behind us. Lucas took my hand. "We did good," he said softly. "You happy?" I hesitated, then nodded. "I should be." He smiled, believing me. I leaned my head against the window, watching the snowfall blur the glass. My reflection stared back, still in lace and makeup, but something inside felt stripped bare. The silence between us was comfortable yet heavy. When we reached the small cabin we'd rented for the night, Lucas carried me inside, laughing as I kicked off my heels. The fireplace crackled. We opened a bottle of wine, toasted to new beginnings. I laughed, pretended not to notice how empty my chest felt. Later, when he fell asleep beside me, I lay awake, staring at the shadows moving across the ceiling. My phone blinked on the nightstand. Another voicemail from Mom. I turned it face down. That night, I realized something I had ignored for years. They would always call me when something was broken, and I would always come running. But not anymore. I turned off the phone, letting the room fall into perfect, heavy silence. For the first time, the quiet didn't scare me. It felt like peace. Or maybe finally the start of being free. Morning light slid through the blinds, painting thin lines across the cabin floor. Lucas was still asleep beside me, his hand resting over mine. For a while, I listened to his breathing and let the warmth of the blanket hide the weight sitting on my chest. Outside, the snow had stopped, and everything was clean, white quiet. I should have felt lucky, but something in me felt unfinished, like I had walked out of one life and hadn't fully stepped into another. It was strange how silence could feel heavier than words. It reminded me of home, of those years in a little town outside Chicago, where silence was the language my family spoke best. My mother was a high school English teacher, always composed her lipstick, never smudged her tone, always polite, even when it cut. My father was an accountant, a man of logic who believed emotion was a luxury. Then there was Emily, 2 years younger, prettier, funnier. The one who filled the rooms I couldn't breathe in. I used to think being the older sister meant being responsible. When Emily broke a vase, I apologized. When she skipped school, I covered for her. My mother would shake her head and say, "That's what big sisters do." It never felt cruel, not at first, just expected. When I was 10, my birthday fell on the same day as Emily's piano recital. My party was canceled and my mother promised we'd celebrate the next weekend. We never did. She said we were too busy. I remember sitting in my room with a cupcake I'd made myself, one candle burning unevenly, the frosting melting down the side. It wasn't sadness I felt, not even anger, just a kind of numb acceptance that came too early for a child. That feeling followed me everywhere. Through high school, where Emily was the cheerleader, and I was the quiet one in AP classes. Through college, when my parents sent her money for textbooks, but told me I was independent enough to figure it out. I worked 2 jobs and told them I was fine. It was easier to let them believe I didn't need anything. The only person who ever seemed to see me was Grandma Evelyn. She lived in a small house with lavender bushes out front and always smelled like soap and vanilla. She'd hold my face in her hands and say I had a kind of strength that didn't need to shout. On my 18th birthday, she gave me a small box with a velvet lining. Inside was a diamond necklace. She said softly, "Wear it on your wedding day so you remember you're worthy of love." I cried then, not because of the necklace, but because someone finally told me I was worth something. When Grandma passed away a few years later, Mom took the necklace to get it cleaned. She said jewelry that old needed care. I believed her. I always did. Years went by. I graduated, moved to Denver, got a job at a tech firm. I learned how to work hard, how to stay invisible in a room full of loud voices. That's where I met Lucas. He wasn't like the others. He listened. He asked questions that made me think instead of shrink. The first time he met my family, I wanted it to go well so badly. I wore the blue dress my mother always said made me look too serious. Emily showed up in red, glowing, charming everyone. At dinner, my mother spent 20 minutes talking about Emily's new marketing job in Chicago. My father nodded proudly, sipping his wine. When Lucas tried to steer the conversation toward us, Mom smiled and said, "You two are doing well," right before turning back to Emily. After dinner, as we walked to the car, Lucas asked gently, "Does it always feel like that?" I tried to laugh it off, saying families are complicated. He didn't push, but I could tell he wanted to. Grandma's house was sold not long after that. The necklace never came up again. When I finally asked about it, Mom sighed and said, "It needed more repair than we thought. Maybe someday, honey." I wanted to believe her, even when something in her tone told me not to. Sometimes I wonder if the distance between us was built on small moments like those, each one, tiny, almost invisible, until they stacked into a wall too high to climb. Lying in that cabin after the wedding, I thought about all of it. The birthdays missed, the quiet dismissals, the necklace locked away somewhere. I used to think I was strong because I could forgive without being asked. Now I wasn't sure if that was strength or just habit. Lucas stirred beside me and mumbled something half asleep. I brushed his hair back and whispered, "Go back to sleep." He smiled without opening his eyes. I slipped out of bed and went to the window. The morning light hit the snow, blinding and pure. I remembered Grandma saying that truth always looks brightest after a storm. Maybe that was what this was, a storm clearing. I made coffee, sat by the fire, and let the memories run their course. It wasn't anger I felt anymore, just clarity. The kind that stings, but also steadies you. When Lucas finally woke, he wrapped his arms around me from behind, his voice still groggy. "You're quiet this morning." I smiled faintly. "Just thinking about home." "Good thoughts or bad ones?" "Maybe both." He kissed my shoulder and said, "You don't have to go back there if it hurts." I nodded, though part of me knew I eventually would. Not to belong again, but to understand why I never really did. Outside, the snow began to melt into small rivers along the driveway. The world was moving forward even if I wasn't ready yet. I thought about my mother's voicemail, about the urgency in her voice when she said she needed me. For once, I didn't feel guilt, only curiosity. I poured another cup of coffee, watching the steam rise. Somewhere deep down, I felt it, the faint pull of unfinished things waiting to surface. The quiet might have felt like peace, but peace never lasts long when the past still has your name on it. 2 days after the wedding, I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand. Lucas was still asleep beside me, breathing softly, the sheets tangled around his legs. I reached for the phone, expecting another flood of congratulations. Instead, it was a message from Maggie. "You're not going to like this," she'd written. "Your mom's been telling everyone you chose your wedding date just to ruin Emily's engagement party." I stared at the words, half expecting them to rearrange themselves into something kinder. They didn't. My throat tightened, a familiar ache I thought I'd buried somewhere under the vows and the white lace. Outside, the morning light looked too sharp, like it was cutting through everything I'd tried to build these past few days. I scrolled through social media against my better judgment. My wedding photos had spread quickly, posted by friends who meant well. Underneath the smiling pictures were comments from relatives I barely spoke to. "So sad her family didn't show. Such a shame. Some people just don't know how to forgive. Forgive what I thought. For existing." Then Maggie sent another link. A short video clip from Emily's engagement party, already gathering thousands of views. My heart stuttered as I pressed play. Emily stood under a string of fairy lights, champagne flute in hand, her fiancé's arm around her waist. She was glowing, all soft laughter and polished charm. Around her neck sparkled something familiar. Grandma's necklace, the one she told me to wear on my wedding day. I turned up the volume. Emily was laughing, saying something to the crowd. The camera caught her voice clearly. "Mom told me to wear this. She said it's our family's good luck charm." My fingers went cold around the phone. For a long time, I just sat there, the video looping the necklace, catching the light again and again. It wasn't the jewelry that broke me. It was hearing my mother's words come out of Emily's mouth. Mom told me. Lucas stirred beside me, his voice rough with sleep. Everything okay? I turned off the screen and set the phone down, my pulse racing. Just family stuff, I said, trying to sound casual. Go back to sleep. He studied my face for a moment, then nodded. He'd learned not to press when it came to my family. When he left for work a few hours later, I sat alone on the couch, the phone still in my hand. The quiet cabin felt heavier than it had the night of the wedding. I called my mother before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was brisk, practiced. I was just about to call you Clara. How was the honeymoon? I took a breath. Mom, why is Emily wearing Grandma's necklace? There was a pause, short but sharp enough to cut through the line. Oh, that. She needed something special for the party. It's just jewelry, Clara. It wasn't just jewelry. I could still hear Grandma's voice, soft and steady, telling me I was worthy of love. My mother's tone flattened that memory into dust. That necklace was meant for me, I said quietly. Don't be dramatic. Emily's the one getting married next. She deserved it more right now. I laughed under my breath, the sound bitter even to my own ears. Of course. She always deserves more. Clara. Her voice softened in that way she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. I didn't think you'd mind. You have so much already. A good job, a husband, your own life. Let your sister have her moment. I wanted to scream, but what came out was only a whisper. You gave away the last thing Grandma ever gave me. Mom sighed. It's only a thing. Things don't matter. I ended the call before I said something I couldn't take back. The silence after hung thick, humming with everything unsaid. For a long time, I sat there staring at the wall, feeling both hollow and furious. I looked at our wedding photos stacked on the table, the framed one of me and Lucas, laughing under the falling snow. I'd thought those pictures would remind me of joy, but now they felt like proof of something else, proof that love in my family was always conditional. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and watched the video again. Each time the same thought crept in, they would always find a way to make me invisible. If I smiled, they'd say I was pretending. If I spoke up, I was ungrateful. The only way they noticed me was when I made things easier for them. When Lucas came home, he found me sitting on the floor, the phone glowing faintly beside me. He knelt down, his brow furrowed. What happened? I showed him the video without a word. He watched it once, jaw tightening, then looked back at me. That's the necklace, isn't it? I nodded. He exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. I'm sorry, Clara. I stared at the fire in the hearth, watching it flicker. You don't have to be sorry. They made their choice. He wanted to say more. I could see it, but he didn't. He just wrapped an arm around me, his warmth steady, his silence respectful. Later that night, I stood by the window watching snow melt under the streetlights. My reflection looked calm, almost detached, but my hands were trembling. I wasn't crying anymore. The sadness had burned off, leaving something clearer, sharper. For years I'd tried to prove I was worth seeing. I had smiled, forgiven, waited. Now I understood. They'd never look at me unless I forced them to. I turned off the phone, locked the screen, and set it face down on the table. The flames in the fireplace hissed softly, settling into embers. If they wanted me invisible, fine. I could use that. The thought was steady, not bitter, almost like a promise forming quietly in the dark. I didn't know how yet, but someday they would see me. And when they did, it wouldn't be as the forgotten daughter. It would be as the woman who stopped waiting for permission to exist. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, my mind already racing. The necklace had become more than a piece of jewelry now. It was a question that refused to rest. I brewed coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. The glow from the screen lit the room while Lucas still slept upstairs. I typed Grandma Evelyn's full name into the probate records of Cook County and waited for the results. When the file appeared, my hands started shaking. There it was, in neat black text jewelry, bequeathed to Clara Whitmore. I stared at it for a long time, tracing the words with my eyes as if they might disappear if I blinked. No clause about repair, no condition, no mention of anyone else. Grandma had been clear. It belonged to me. I scrolled through the document again, reading every line, every signature. My mother's name appeared at the bottom as executor. That was how she had access to everything. It explained how the necklace had never reached me, how she could twist the story into something convenient. When Lucas came down, his hair still messy from sleep, he asked what I was doing. "Looking at ghosts," I said. He frowned. "Want to talk about it?" I turned the screen toward him. Grandma's will. She left it to me. He leaned closer, reading the lines, then looked at me carefully. "Are you sure you want to dig this up?" I met his eyes. "It's already dug up." He nodded, pulling out a chair beside me. I could tell he wanted to be supportive but also cautious. Sometimes his practicality was comforting, sometimes it felt like sandpaper. A few hours later, I called Aunt Denise, Grandma's younger sister. She lived in Michigan and had always been the quiet one at family gatherings, more of an observer than a participant. When she answered, her voice cracked with surprise. "Clara, I haven't heard from you in ages. I asked if she remembered the necklace." "Of course. Your grandmother wore it every Sunday. She was so proud of that piece." Why I told her what had happened about the video about Emily wearing it. The silence on the other end stretched until it hurt. "Your mother showed that necklace to everyone after the funeral," she said finally. "Told them it was staying in the family, meant for Emily one day." I remember thinking it was strange, but I didn't want to interfere. It felt like someone had pressed a stone into my chest. My mother hadn't just lied. She had rewritten the story entirely. "Thank you," I said quietly. "That helps more than you know." After we hung up, I printed the will and laid it on the desk beside my laptop. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Proof always does. Lucas came into the room again, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He set one beside me and said softly, "Maybe it's time to let this go." I looked up at him, exhaustion and anger mixing inside me. If I let it go, they'll believe they were right. He sighed, sitting on the edge of the desk, "And if you don't, then they'll have to face what they did." He didn't argue after that. Instead, he placed his hand over mine and said, "Then do it the right way." That afternoon, I searched for a lawyer who specialized in estate disputes. I found Vincent Gray, a name that came up in several articles about inheritance law in Illinois. His office was in downtown Chicago, all glass and calm lighting. The next day, I took the train there, the city passing by in cold February gray. Sitting across from him, I explained everything from the will to the voicemail to the video. He listened without interrupting, only nodding occasionally, his fingers steepled under his chin. When I finished, he said, "It's a clear violation of the estate distribution, assuming what you've shown me is authentic. You can file a petition to reclaim the asset." He paused, studying me. "But I need to ask. Is this about the necklace or something bigger?" "Both," I admitted. He smiled faintly. "Fair answer." He outlined the steps: file a claim, notify the executor, attach supporting evidence. I felt oddly calm, as if the plan itself steadied me. When I left his office, snow was falling again. The city lights blurred in the white air, and I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. That night back home, I sat in my office while Lucas cooked dinner. I opened a new folder on my laptop and named it For Justice. Inside, I saved the will, the screenshots, the emails, everything. The cursor blinked at me, patient waiting. For years, my family had treated me like a background character in their story. But now I was writing a new one. Lucas knocked gently on the doorframe. "Dinner's ready. You've been in here for hours." I looked up at him, smiled. "Just finishing something." He leaned against the doorway. "Whatever you're planning, make sure it's worth what it costs." I nodded, meaning it when I said, "It already is." After he left, I closed the laptop and sat in the dim light, the house silent, except for the soft hum of the heater. The air smelled faintly of garlic and rosemary. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering everything it touched, erasing lines, softening edges. I wondered if that was what justice felt like at the beginning, not loud or triumphant, but quiet, steady, a kind of calm before the reckoning. The clock ticked toward midnight. I ran my fingers over the edge of the printed will and whispered to no one. Grandma, I'm not done yet. Somewhere deep inside, I felt the same certainty I'd had the night of the wedding. This time, though, it wasn't about peace. It was about purpose. And purpose once found doesn't let go easily. 2 years passed, and the sharp edges of my anger had turned into something steadier, more deliberate. I'd left my old job at the tech company and taken a position at a nonprofit in Denver called Haven for Women. Within a year, I was running the place. The work was hard but clean honest. Every day I listened to women who'd been silenced or stripped of what was rightfully theirs: houses, pensions, inheritances. I didn't just sympathize, I understood. Each story felt like a mirror I'd already looked into. The lawsuit over Grandma's necklace had dragged on quietly in the background, a slow-moving machine of paperwork and procedural delays. Vincent had been patient, methodical. My mother's lawyers stalled, asked for extensions, filed motions that went nowhere. Lucas kept asking how long it would take, and I kept telling him I didn't care. Justice didn't have an expiration date. We had built a calm, simple life together. Our townhouse in Boulder had wide windows and a garden I tended on weekends. Lucas liked to joke that I'd turned into someone who could stare a storm down and still sleep at night. Maybe he was right. I had learned how to live with the quiet kind of power that comes when you stop needing anyone's permission. One Friday evening, as I was closing my laptop after a long day of meetings, a message from Maggie popped up. A single link and 3 words. You should see this. I clicked before thinking. The page loaded with bright colors, sleek fonts, a familiar sparkle. Evelyn Grace, it read in gold letters. Beneath it a tagline, a legacy of timeless beauty. I froze. The logo was a stylized pendant, an exact replica of Grandma's necklace. Every detail down to the teardrop diamond and delicate chain had been turned into branding. I scrolled further, finding a glossy press release featuring Emily's face. She stood in a soft beige dress, smiling confidently beside my mother, who was listed as Chief Financial Officer. My pulse quickened. They had used Grandma's name, her jewelry, even her legacy, to sell perfume and luxury candles. The words blurred as I kept reading. Inspired by generations of strength and grace. I wanted to throw the laptop across the room. Instead, I closed it, inhaled slowly, and reached for my phone. Vincent answered on the second ring. Clara, it's been a while. Everything okay? Not really. They just launched a company called Evelyn Grace. They used the necklace in their logo. There was a pause on his end, the kind that comes from someone mentally flipping through the legal codes. Do you have proof it's the same design I do? And my mother's name is on the business registration. He exhaled. Then it's time. We file. Lucas came home a few minutes later, the smell of takeout following him through the door. I told him what happened, and he stood there for a moment holding 2 paper bags, silent. Then he set them down and said quietly, "Are you sure this is what you want?" I nodded. It's not about revenge. It's about truth. He looked at me, pride and worry mixed in his eyes. Just promise me you won't let it eat you alive. I smiled faintly. It won't. It already did once. That weekend I met Vincent in his office. We went over the paperwork, the photos, the recordings, the will. He spread everything across his mahogany desk like pieces of a puzzle. You have more than enough evidence, he said, but they'll probably offer a settlement. I shook my head. I don't want money. I want acknowledgement. He studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. Then we do it your way. Driving home through the falling snow, I felt something I hadn't in years: control. Not the kind that comes from anger, but the kind that comes from finally standing on solid ground. That night I sat with Lucas by the fireplace, the glow of the flames washing over us. He asked what I would do if they called, tried to apologize. I thought about it. I'd listen maybe, but some things can't be fixed with words. He took my hand. You're stronger than anyone I know. Maybe, I said softly, but I wish I didn't have to be. The following week, the lawsuit was officially filed. It didn't make the news right away, but inside me it felt like a quiet earthquake. The next day at work, one of my clients, a woman fighting to reclaim her late father's house, asked how I stayed so calm. I told her the truth. Fear stops mattering once you've already survived the worst kind of loss. That night, as I went through the new case files, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Maggie. A screenshot of an article headline, Evelyn Grace's founders celebrate family legacy. The photo beneath it showed my mother cutting a ribbon while Emily held up a perfume bottle, the necklace logo glowing behind them. I stared at it for a long time, then whispered to myself, if that's their legacy, then justice will be mine. Lucas came in holding 2 mugs of tea. He set one beside me and kissed my temple. Whatever happens, you've already won, he said. Maybe. But I wanted more than a win. I wanted the truth to stand where their lies had been. The fire cracked softly, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the trees. I opened my laptop again, the screen lighting up with Vincent's email confirming our court date. For a moment, I watched the cursor blink, steady and patient, like it was waiting for me to take the next step. I leaned back, let the silence settle, and smiled. For the first time in years, I didn't feel afraid. Not of them, not of what came next, not even of the truth. The next morning, Vincent filed the petition with the Superior Court of Massachusetts. Every document, every photograph, every notarized signature was in that stack. When I saw the official seal pressed onto the top page, a quiet wave of relief ran through me. It was real now, no longer just my private ache, but a case with weight and consequence. Vincent called later that afternoon. The filing went through. We'll wait for the judge to set a hearing date. Try not to check the docket every hour, he said, and I could hear a smile in his voice. I laughed softly. No promises. Within a week, the first ripple appeared. A journalist named Phoebe Lane emailed me. She was well known for her investigative column on inheritance disputes and family feuds among America's wealthy. She'd somehow learned about the filing through public records. She wrote that the story of a daughter fighting for her grandmother's legacy against a luxury brand using the same name had cultural teeth. We met at a small cafe near downtown Boston. She was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s. Sharp eyes, no pretense. She asked if I wanted to go on record. Not yet, I told her. But you can tell the story. Leave my name out of it. She agreed. A week later, her article went live, The Stolen Legacy. The headline was clean, almost surgical. It detailed how the company Evelyn Grace was built around an heirloom currently under legal dispute. She included public information only, but the timing was perfect. Within hours, the piece spread through financial circles. Bloggers speculated, analysts dissected the brand's shaky foundation. By the end of the day, Vincent texted me a single line, "You just lit a match." Meanwhile, Emily was preparing for her wedding in New York. According to social media, it was set to be lavish, hosted at a private estate in the Hamptons, filmed by a lifestyle network for a segment called Modern Heiresses. My mother was listed as the visionary behind the family brand. I scrolled through the promotional photos, seeing the necklace logo printed on banners, napkins, even champagne bottles. Vincent and I met again to go over strategy. He'd already sent the production company a notice that any public representation of the disputed design could fall under intellectual property violation pending the court's ruling. He said it calmly, like he was reading the weather forecast. I asked, "Do you think they'll care?" He shrugged. "They'll care when it's on paper with a judge's signature." The hearing date came through sooner than expected. The court had accepted the case, and the filing was now public record. That meant the will, the executor's name, and the original inheritance clause were accessible to anyone who looked. Within 48 hours, legal blogs began dissecting the case, and someone connected the dots to Evelyn Grace. The first call came from my mother. I saw her name on the screen and hesitated before answering. Her voice was sharp, thinner than I remembered. "Clara, what did you do? There's a story about us everywhere. Your sister is devastated." I kept my tone even. I reminded them that laws don't disappear because they're inconvenient. She exhaled hard, like someone trying not to shout. You could have come to us first. We could have handled this privately. We tried private for years, I said quietly. You just never listened. For a moment, all I heard was her breathing. Then she said, "You've humiliated us." "No," I said. "I reminded you that accountability exists." She hung up. The silence afterward felt like a victory and a loss at once. That night I sat by the window in my office looking out at the dark city. The court's confirmation email glowed on my screen. Lucas came in, his hair damp from the shower, wearing the t-shirt I loved on him. He asked how I felt. Like the world finally tilted the right way, I said. He kissed my forehead. "You're incredible." You know that I smiled, but deep down, a small tremor of uncertainty rippled through me. Winning legally was one thing. Facing them emotionally was another. 2 days later, Phoebe called. Her voice carried the same mix of excitement and disbelief. "Your story's everywhere," she said. "The financial pages, lifestyle blogs, even morning talk shows. They're calling it the legacy lawsuit." "You sure you don't want to comment?" I hesitated, then said, "Not yet. Let the facts talk first." By the following week, the pressure around Emily's wedding was mounting. The production company reached out to Vincent, concerned about airing the feature, now tied to controversy. He sent them a copy of the court documents. A day later, they confirmed the segment would be postponed until further notice. That same evening, my mother called again. This time, her tone wasn't angry, it was shaken. "Clara, what are you doing to us?" I answered quietly. "I'm not doing anything to you. I'm just doing what's right. You're destroying your sister's future." "No, Mom. She built that on something that was never hers to take." She went silent, then whispered, "You always were ungrateful." I didn't respond. The line clicked dead. When I turned back to the window, I saw my reflection against the glass. My face looked calm, composed, but my hands were still trembling. For years I had wanted my mother to see me. Now she finally did, but as an adversary, not a daughter. Maybe that was the only way she ever would. I closed my laptop, turned off the lights, and sat in the dark for a moment, listening to the hum of the city below. Somewhere my sister was probably rehearsing vows under crystal chandeliers, unaware that the ground beneath her was shifting. The phone on my desk buzzed a message from Vincent. "The court has confirmed the inheritance documents. They're officially public record." I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I typed back one line. "Good. Let the truth breathe." Outside, the wind picked up sharp and cold, rattling the window. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this point. For the first time since the wedding, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen, completely unmistakably seen. And the silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was full of consequence. The morning of Emily's wedding arrived like the calm before a storm. Boston was gray and wet rain streaking the windows of my office, but all the headlines glittered with her name. "A fairy tale wedding in New York," one article read. "The heiress behind Evelyn Grace marries tech executive Ryan Caldwell." I scrolled without emotion. Every photo looked perfectly staged, every detail polished for the camera. It was the kind of event my mother lived for: chandeliers, silk, and spectacle. Vincent had texted me earlier. "All filings verified." The court released the documents. I stared at that message, then turned to the muted TV in the corner of the office. The network covering the ceremony had started its broadcast. Emily appeared on screen in a shimmering white gown, smiling like the world belonged to her. The logo of Evelyn Grace glimmered on the backdrop behind her. I watched her glide through the crowd, hand in hand with her fiancé. My mother stood beside them, glowing under the lights. For a moment, I felt something like grief, not for them, but for the illusion that any of it had ever meant family. At noon, my phone buzzed. It was Phoebe. "You should probably turn up the volume," she said. I unmuted the television. The reporter, cheerful and unassuming, asked the question that sliced through the room like a blade. "That necklace you're wearing, isn't it the one from your grandmother Evelyn's collection?" The camera zoomed in on Emily's neck. Her smile faltered. She blinked, her voice catching. "Yes," she said after a pause. "It belonged to my grandmother. She wanted it to stay in the family. Before she could finish, the broadcast cut briefly to breaking news. Across the bottom of the screen ran a headline: Massachusetts court confirms Whitmore inheritance lawsuit, original beneficiary identified. Phoebe's timing had been exact. The article she'd scheduled went live at that moment, complete with the court's official statement and copies of the unsealed will. The screen split, one half showing Emily's frozen expression, the other displaying the headline. The anchors scrambled. The audience murmured, and the fairy tale cracked right in front of everyone. In the footage, Emily's fiancé leaned toward her, whispering something. His face drained of color. My mother, standing behind them, pressed her lips together, her eyes darting toward the cameras. The reporter, visibly uncomfortable, tried to pivot to another topic, but it was too late. The clip had already gone viral. Lucas walked into the office as I sat there, the room glowing from the screen's light. He looked from me to the TV. Is that Emily's wedding? I nodded. He came closer, eyes narrowing at the chaos unfolding. Guests whispering, producers scrambling, photographers lowering their cameras. The anchor back in the studio was already issuing a statement about unexpected developments. He whispered, "Did Phoebe plan this?" I didn't answer. We both knew the truth. Within minutes, the internet was flooded. Heirloom scandal at Evelyn Grace wedding. Family legacy unravels live on air. My mother's name trended for the first time in her life, and not the way she wanted. The phone on my desk rang. Her number. I hesitated before picking up. "Clara, what have you done?" Her voice was shaking, thin, unfamiliar. I took a slow breath. "I reminded you that the law still matters. You humiliated us. No, Mom. You did that when you chose appearances over integrity." There was silence. Then, barely audible, she said, "You'll regret this." I hung up before the tremor in my hands could show in my voice. Lucas stood quietly beside me. "You okay?" I didn't know what to call what I was feeling. Relief, maybe. Or just stillness. "No," I said softly. "But I'm at peace." He touched my shoulder. "That's enough." We watched together as the news replayed the footage from different angles. In one shot, my mother turned and walked out of the ballroom, cameras flashing behind her. Emily stood alone at the altar, reporters shouting questions she didn't answer. The groom stepped away, talking rapidly to someone off-screen. By evening, every major network carried the story. My inbox filled with messages from journalists, old friends, distant relatives pretending concern. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, the light fading behind the rain. Lucas poured 2 glasses of wine, handing me one. He studied me for a long time, then asked, "So what now?" I took a sip. "Nothing. The truth is already moving on its own." He nodded. "I'm proud of you." I smiled faintly. I'm not sure pride fits this moment. Maybe clarity does. He sat beside me, and for a while we didn't talk. The city outside flickered under streetlights, the rain finally slowing. On the muted TV, a commentator called it a modern morality play. Maybe it was. Maybe all I'd done was hold up a mirror and let them look. The clock struck 9. The phone vibrated once more, an email notification from Vincent. The court had confirmed the next hearing date. The official investigation into misuse of estate assets was underway. I closed the screen, the sound of the rain soft again. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was chasing justice. I was watching it arrive, steady and unstoppable, exactly when it needed to. Outside, the storm cleared the streetlights, catching the wet pavement. The night felt strangely calm, the kind of calm that comes only after truth has finally stepped into the light. A few months later, spring settled over Boston, soft and reluctant, the kind that made the air smell like rain and new beginnings. The case had stretched longer than anyone expected, but when the ruling finally came, it arrived with quiet certainty. The court recognized me as the legal owner of the diamond necklace belonging to Evelyn Whitmore. My grandmother's name. My name. The announcement filled headlines the next morning. The Whitmore legacy case, the papers called it, as if it were some grand drama instead of a long fight for something simple and true. The court's order required Emily and my mother to issue a public apology. It wasn't long before a statement appeared online polished by lawyers full of remorseful phrases that didn't sound like them at all. The company Evelyn Grace dissolved within weeks. The investors withdrew the website, disappeared the logo that once gleamed on every screen, quietly erased. When Vincent called to tell me the final paperwork was filed, I thanked him, though my voice came out flat. He laughed softly. "You don't sound happy, Clara." I told him happiness wasn't the point, justice was. He said that was exactly what Grandma Evelyn would have wanted. Lucas and I drove to the cemetery the next weekend. The sky was gray, low clouds hanging over the city like a blanket. I carried the necklace in a small velvet box, the same one Grandma had given me years ago. The diamond caught what little light there was as I lifted it. For a long time I just stood there staring at her name etched into the stone. I put the necklace around my neck, feeling the cold metal settle against my skin. It was heavier than I remembered, or maybe I was just finally strong enough to carry what it meant. I whispered, "I kept my promise, Grandma. I made them remember you." Lucas slipped his hand into mine. "You did more than that," he said. "You brought your family back in your own way." I smiled faintly. Maybe. Or maybe I just brought the truth home. We stood there a while longer until the wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of lilacs from somewhere nearby. It felt like her, that quiet grace she always carried, reminding me that victory didn't have to roar. Sometimes it just breathed. A month later, I launched the Grace Foundation, named not after revenge, but after what came after it. We started small, one office, 3 staff members, a few volunteers. Our mission was simple: help women reclaim what was rightfully theirs, whether that was money, property, or dignity. The opening event was modest, but Phoebe attended, notebook in hand, watching everything with that same sharp curiosity that had once changed my story. When she approached me afterward, she smiled. "If Evelyn could see this, what do you think she'd say?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. "She'd probably say she's proud I didn't choose hate." Phoebe nodded, closing her notebook. "That's a story worth telling again." As people mingled and laughed around us, I looked out the window. The afternoon light poured through the glass, soft and forgiving. The necklace gleamed faintly against my collarbone. For the first time, it didn't feel like a reminder of loss, but of everything I had rebuilt from it. Later that night, when the last guests left, Lucas helped me stack chairs and fold tablecloths. He looked at me with that same steady warmth he always carried. "You finally did it," he said. I shook my head. "No, we did it." He laughed, always sharing credit. "It's easier that way," I said. "Justice should belong to more than one person." We drove home in comfortable silence, the city quiet around us. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, and I felt an odd peace settle over me. Maybe it was closure. Or maybe it was the beginning of something new. At home, I hung the necklace on the stand by the mirror. For years, I had imagined this moment would feel triumphant, like an ending. Instead, it felt calm. I traced the chain with my finger, the diamond catching the lamplight. They hadn't come to my wedding, and for a long time that had felt like the wound I'd never heal from. But standing there in the home I'd built, surrounded by people who chose to stay, I realized something simple and quiet. Sometimes the family you lose makes space for the one you find. Lucas came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my shoulders. "You look lighter," he murmured. "I guess I finally am," I said. He kissed the top of my head. "That's the woman I fell in love with." We turned off the lights, the city glowing faintly outside our window. I lay in bed, listening to the hum of distant traffic, the rhythm of life going on. For the first time, I didn't replay old conversations or imagine what could have been. The silence was clean now, not empty, but full. In the dark, I thought of my grandmother again, of her soft voice telling me to wear the necklace on my wedding day, so I'd remember I was worthy of love. I hadn't worn it then. But maybe it wasn't meant for that day. Maybe it was meant for this one, when I finally understood what she meant. If anyone ever asked me what justice felt like, I'd tell them it wasn't fire. It was light, steady, quiet, patient. And maybe that's what forgiveness felt like too. Not forgetting, but freeing yourself enough to keep walking forward. So, if you've ever been written out of your own story, know this: you can write it back. Maybe not with revenge, but with truth. And the truth, once it stands in the light, never really fades. Because sometimes, when the people who should have loved you don't show up, life gives you the chance to show up for yourself. And that, I've learned, is the most beautiful kind of justice there is.